What's up, everybody? Welcome into something a little bit different. It's not that many cases that we start talking about them so early on that we don't even have an arrest. We don't even have a criminal defendant. We don't even have anybody really accused or charged with a crime. So they're not obviously convicted. They're more than presumed innocent at this point. They really haven't done anything wrong as far as the public record shows, but they're obviously being investigated. We're talking about P. Diddy, Sean Combs, Puff Daddy, all of the above. His homes were raided in multiple states by federal agents, which is really interesting. We've covered some of the civil lawsuits against him. We'll talk about how that plays in criminal charges. But specifically today, I wanted to bring my dad in, who's a former federal prosecutor. He was the chief of the criminal division. He was the one signing off on a lot of these types of raids and planning. What evidence do they need to find? What's in the search warrants? Who can they raid? Who can they not raid? What do they take into account when it's a high-profile criminal defendant? Are they more careful? All those questions will be answered and more today. Dad, thanks for joining us. We're also going to have I'm going to play a video in the background at some point, kind of as B-roll, just to show you what it looked like. I mean, they came with long guns. They were taking people out of the house with hands behind their head, handcuffing them, multiple buildings that they're searching. So what was kind of your first thought when you heard and saw that P. Diddy's multiple mansions, I heard Miami as well, was raided by federal agents?
Yeah, my first thought was his lawyers should not have been surprised that his houses were going to be raided. That I think that there was a lot out there that would have given them a heads up that something like this was going to happen, that they were going to come and raid those houses, and it was going to happen sooner rather than later.
Why do you say that?
Well, from what I can gather, the three females and the male lawsuit victims were interviewed by law enforcement, and that law enforcement indicated they're going to interview other individuals. So the fact that there was an investigation, I don't think that's a secret.
Okay.
And it was the Homeland Security investigation, not the FBI or these other agencies.
Yeah, why was it Homeland Security? That's a question a lot of people have. Why Homeland Security?
Well, because it's sex trafficking is a priority for Homeland Security because they're also in charge of the borders. So they have the responsibility for sex trafficking, as most, all law enforcement agencies do, but it's a priority for Homeland Security for sex trafficking. So that's one reason why I think that Homeland Security was in this, that they got it first. I guess that happens a lot in federal agencies, is where does the investigation go first? Homeland Security investigation started it, so they claimed it, and now it's their investigation. They can get aid from other agencies like the FBI, but they're running the show. And if you, again, looked at who was conducting these searches, they used Homeland Security investigators in Miami and in Los Angeles with the help of local law enforcement that usually provides security. But Homeland Security investigations, because Homeland Security is responsible for the borders and because a key aspect is sex trafficking.
So, and I have this on 2x speed just to kind of roll through while we talk, and the sound is off. It just kind of gives us an idea of what the house was, what the property was they searched. Obviously, a huge piece of property, a lot of work to do. What's the federal prosecutor's involvement at this point, especially when it's multi-jurisdictional? Do they have any say in who investigates it? I think you kind of already answered that. No, it's whoever gets it first. But what is their involvement in this kind of the process, in the search warrants, and what they're looking for and what they might be charging?
Well, to get a search warrant, you've got to go before a federal judge or a federal magistrate. Normally, again, I'm talking the norm. The norm is that an assistant U.S. attorney will review the affidavit for a search warrant. Affidavits are normally initially prepared by the agency and the key agent that's in charge of the investigation. There is one agent in Homeland Security somewhere that's the lead agent in this case, and he prepared the affidavit. It's a rough draft because it's kind of smoothed over and wordsmithed by an assistant U.S. attorney once he gets it, to make it maybe sound a little smoother and take care of some of the issues involved, that things you have to have in an affidavit in order to get this search warrant. So they take it to the assistant U.S. attorney. Excuse me. The assistant U.S. attorney then presents it to a federal judge. Federal judge reviews it for probable cause and then signs off on the search warrant. because it's a federal judge, it's a nationwide search warrant. So even though it's signed in New York, which my guess is this one was, it was taken for Miami, which is the Southern District of Florida, and Los Angeles, and the searches were executed. But again, the warrant has specific things in it that have to happen in order for a judge to approve it.
And you can't just go search anything and everything. It has to be reasonable within the warrant. Now, the warrant can say the entire house, but specifically, how does the warrant connect to the potential charges?
Well, there's in this case, and I'll try to limit it to this case because it's what we're talking about here rather than just generally. In this case, we have allegations that there was videoing or filming. So they're going to be looking for videos. That might be one heck of a job because somebody like this with a house like this probably has a lot of videos and a lot of recordings. So, I mean, he's a recording artist. So how many recordings that they're going to review in order to see if there's any evidence of the recordings that the victims alleged? It's going to take them days and days to go through all those. So they're looking for recordings. Obviously, recordings can be hidden almost anywhere. So they're going to be downloading all of the data that's in the computers that's sitting in that house. They're going to be taking what's called mirror images, where they're going to take all the data, put it onto a hard drive, take it away with them somewhere so they can analyze it at their own pace. The other thing that they might be looking for is they might be looking for things that were specifically described by the victims. For instance, there was a yellow bed cover. There was a bathroom to the left that had blue tile. Those specifics, in order to back up the statements of the victims, are something they're also going to look for because they're going to take photos and videos of everything they do in this search, that later on, when the victim testifies about a particular view or something they saw in the house, they'll be able to say, yes, this is in the house. Here's that blue tile. Here's that yellow bed cover. So that's another thing they're looking for. When they do these search warrants too, it's not just probable cause that a crime occurred, but probable cause that evidence of that crime is still located in the house. These crimes, some of them occurred in the 90s. You've got a situation where you might be looking for evidence that's 20 and 30 years old. So you're going to have to tell a judge that you think that it's reasonable to believe that there's probable cause to believe that there is still evidence of these crimes in that house.
And I think one of the other interesting parts is the amount of resources and manpower that was put into these searches is obviously unusual, right? I mean, if a doctor defrauded Medicare out of $500,000, they're not going to send this amount of people. Why are the resources that we're seeing put into these searches signed off on in this case, and why are they so heavily armed? Why are there so many agents there? How does that affect how this all looks and what they're doing in this investigation?
Well, it's like anything else. They try to overwhelm with manpower so no one gives them any trouble. They have so many people there that no one's even going to think of giving them any trouble. The handcuffing, for instance, I read that his two sons were handcuffed for a period of time.
His two sons?
Yes, his two
Okay,
sons.
I didn't see that.
Yeah, his two sons. They're adults. And the reason for that is they secure the premises so that no one can destroy any evidence or move any evidence
And
or
for
do
their
anything, and for their safety. So they keep them out of the way. That's not unusual. The other thing you've got to look at in this case, aside again from the high profile nature of it, look at the size of that house. I'm glad you're showing the video because I hadn't seen the size of that house. I mean, think how many people you need to search a house that big.
His guest house looks like a mansion.
I know, for something like a video. I mean, just think about that. Think about all of again, he's a recording artist and a producer. Think how much electronics there are in the house.
Mm-hmm.
Think how many computers. Think how much data is stored throughout that house. I mean, he's probably got studios in that house. He's got all sorts of items that they're going to need a lot of technical help when they're in there. I guarantee you that there are some specific technical people in there to deal with this, not just law enforcement, but people that know how to handle the technical aspects of all the data and the downloads.
So you mentioned early that it shouldn't be a surprise to his lawyers that this is coming based on the civil lawsuits, things like that. So a couple questions on that. Number one, people said that, he got on his private plane and went to Barbados. What's extradition like in cases like this? How hard would it be for him to just kind of disappear? Is that something that happens in these kinds of cases? What does that look like to you if you're the federal prosecutor on this case?
Well, first off, I think first of all I got to say is that was really a lot of speculation. No one really knows if he did or not.
Mm-hmm.
They know his jet did because they have that. They track these
Tracking
private jets now, so they know his jet went to the Caribbean. Sex trafficking is a universal pariah throughout the world. So it is not as tough as it used to be to extradite somebody when it's a sex trafficking case. Financial crimes are a lot tougher to extradite somebody because they stole money or they didn't pay their taxes. When it comes to sex trafficking, there's very few places you can go now where there's not some kind of agreement. They call them letters rogatory or treaties or letter agreements with a particular country that would allow an extradition for sex trafficking. It's harder to hide.
They
And
could
let's
have,
face it.
like, theoretically, they could have limited his ability to travel if they
Oh yeah.
wanted to, right?
Oh sure. Oh yeah.
And they didn't.
No, they
That
didn't,
we know
and
of.
they
I should
absolutely
say that
could.
we know of at this point. They haven't limited his ability to travel, which kind of leads me to my next question. We'll come back to the civil cases in a second, but how far along are you in an investigation if you're raiding multiple properties with this manpower, this resources? This is not early in the investigation. This is not the first step that they do. This is not the first thing that they do. They've already gathered a lot of evidence, right? So, I mean, at this point, how far along do you think they are in the investigation, and how likely are it that we're going to see, is it that we're going to see federal charges?
They're at least at a midpoint or maybe a little more. And the reason I say that is, remember, we talked about the affidavit where there has to be probable cause. They have to have gathered enough evidence to create an affidavit to show a judge that there's probable cause to search the house. So they've had to have, as we know, they've already interviewed the 3 females and the 1 male. And so they've gathered enough evidence to put into an affidavit to convince a judge, number one, probable cause. Number two, there's still evidence in those houses they could use. Another thing, and one of the allegations from the civil complaints was that some of this activity took place in a studio in New York. But I haven't heard where that studio in New York was searched, which I found interesting as well. So we're at least midpoint, maybe a little bit more than midpoint in an investigation when you do this kind of stuff. And like you said before, how much did this search cost? I mean, how much manpower, how many hours of law enforcement, not just for the search, but then when they gather all this stuff, they're going to have to take it back to the office and look through it. How many days is that going to take?
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting to think that at this point, would you say that it's more likely than not that there will be charges?
I think so. If I were to guess, I'd say yes. It's more likely than
It
not that
doesn't mean they're
someone is going to be
guaranteed. It just
charged.
means more than 50% chance that there's charges at this
Yes.
point, which to me is a lot more than where we were a few months ago talking about the Cassie civil case that he settled rather quickly. And one of the reasons these cases get settled quick is because civil cases can steamroll if there's enough of them, if there's enough noise, if there's enough evidence building, they can absolutely turn into criminal cases. Not always, but oftentimes where there's this much smoke, there ends up being fire. So how do federal prosecutors or state prosecutors even use or cross over with a civil case where civil lawyers who are being paid basically to prosecute it civilly and for money, if they're gathering a bunch of information, how often is it that you'll share that information back and forth as a federal prosecutor?
Oh, I mean, well, you won't share a lot from federal
You
prosecutors
don't
to the
share with
civil
them, but
lawyers,
you let them share with you.
but you let them share with you, right? And yes, absolutely. So, in fact, those civil lawyers want to share with you
Right.
because this does nothing but help their case.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Criminal charges adds a lot of pressure. Convictions make it a guaranteed win for you on the civil side.
Oh, absolutely. And the reason that the federal prosecutors like to get the civil information is because in the civil cases, they're allowed to subpoena witnesses. Even again, I don't know if he was ever deposed, but Diddy could have been deposed. And so that could have been shared. So you've got to realize there's a lot of information coming to that federal prosecutor from those civil lawyers, and they're happy about it. They're happy to share it.
So all it does is add fuel to the fire, basically, when there are
Right.
civil cases with civil lawyers that have, justice on their mind, but also money behind them as a incentive to win these lawsuits against obviously a very collectible defendant. When they can prove it and add more pressure with criminal charges, especially federal criminal charges, there's basically no better piece of evidence. Now, you said the federal prosecutors don't share stuff with the civil plaintiffs lawyers, but let's say the federal case, let's say Diddy takes a plea, gets sentenced, things like that, and there's a criminal file, and now it's kind of closed on the federal side. Will they then share information with the civil attorneys? Because state attorneys will. How does it work federally?
Normally, they don't, because there's a thing called Rule 6 that keeps that stuff still confidential and secret. Now, there can be a court order that allows the sharing, but without a court order, they don't just turn around and share. Now, if the case had gone to discovery, for instance, where the federal prosecutor had sent the evidence to the defense lawyer for the defense lawyer to do it, then that defense lawyer, that could be a little easier for the civil lawyer to get. But until that happens, everything is still Rule 6. And without a court order, they're not sharing anything with those civil lawyers. And so even this is going to end up being grand jury material.
How does it change in your mind if you're a federal prosecutor sending out federal agents to raid multiple properties? Is your mindset any different if you know it's a high profile defendant that's going to have the best legal team? Are there extra debriefs? Is there extra pressure put on there to everybody to be careful? Don't go anywhere near crossing any lines. The cameras are going to be, because I mean, they probably did 20 other searches this month that there were no helicopter cameras hovering over them, filming every step that they do, let alone security cameras on the property. So how does that change in the mind of the federal prosecutor and federal agents in parts of these investigations?
Well, they wouldn't admit it. I mean, they're,
Right.
they're not going to say, oh, because he's high profile, oh, because he has
But it
this
is.
lawyer, we did anything different. But as a practical matter, absolutely. You know that everything's going to be scrutinized. You know that everything is going to be looked at by 10 people, because this guy can afford 10 people to look at everything. So you know that you better be careful. Now, I've got to say, I'm looking at that armored vehicle there. I've got to say that this to me looked like a little overkill. Uh,
I mean, the
but
long weapons and how many guys have bulletproof vests look like they're going into, a war zone. Like they
I
literally
know,
look like
I
they're
know.
going to war with what they're wearing. How unusual is that in these kinds of searches?
Well, the armored vehicle to me, I haven't seen armored vehicles in very many searches. Um,
Like maybe
but
when they were doing like the drug stuff, when it's like a drug cartel or drug lord or whatever.
well, honestly, there may be an allegation of drugs in this search warrant,
Yeah,
because
okay,
there is.
but it's still different than when you were in Miami
Oh,
and they used
oh
to have
yeah,
these compounds with everybody with
oh
AK-47s
yeah,
protecting it. That's when I can understand the armored vehicle and going in like this. But he's got a couple sons there. He records music. Like maybe he's doing some horrible, heinous things to people in there. But how much? I mean, obviously, better safe than sorry. I'm not going to blame anybody for being
yeah.
safe when something could be dangerous, but it seems like a lot.
Well, it seems like a lot, but again, I guess what they're worried about is, um, and not to be demeaning, but there is a culture of violence as well, um, because he's got some past violent arrests or activity in his
Allegations.
distant past.
If you're
Yes,
talking about
allegations.
other rappers and stuff, those are all just
Well, him too,
allegations,
and him
unfounded.
too. Yeah,
Yeah.
him too.
Yeah.
So maybe they're concerned. Again, the idea is when you come with overwhelming force, you have a smaller chance of anybody causing you any trouble. So I guess they just decided to come with overwhelming force. And the other point too is when you're asking about, uh, are you more careful? You don't do something like this unless I think there's a good chance that charges are coming because of the publicity. How
Right.
embarrassing is it going to be if they did all this, they spent all this money, it was on every national news everywhere, and nothing comes of it. So that's going to be pretty embarrassing. So, you don't want to be embarrassed as the U.S. attorney.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And yeah, he's had, I think, some weapons charges in the past. And allegedly involved in other things. But I also did hear that there were drugs and potentially firearms or weapons charges as part of these investigations as well. So I mean, I get it. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong going in bulletproof vest, ready for anything with guns and whatever. It just seems like a lot at this point, especially based on what we know and what we think we know. So, I mean, they're obviously taking it seriously. And that's kind of the level of resources and manpower and force they're putting into this would lead me to believe they think that they're going forward. They feel like they have a case here. They're getting what they need to prosecute this case and win beyond a reasonable doubt. They already obviously have enough for probable cause. Well, I shouldn't say obviously. They have enough for probable cause to search the house, maybe not necessarily probable cause to arrest him just yet. So what are the next steps in the process now that we know there's obviously a federal investigation? There's no denying that at this point, right?
Oh, yeah, obviously not.
So then what are the next steps once you raid somebody's house or office and gain more information trying to prove up those charges?
Well, first, again, in this case, I think there's going to be a big delay because of all the data and all the evidence they're going to be going through. I mean, look at the size of that house. I mean, think of what the stuff that they found and took out of there probably, and the other house as well. By the time they go through it all and analyze it, I bet you that's going to take months. Then they write reports, and then those reports go to the U.S. attorney. Then there's more grand jury investigation where witnesses are subpoenaed into the grand jury. And my guess is, again, from what I've read from the civil complaints, there may be some very high profile people that are subpoenaed to the grand jury. So that's going to take some time. This investigation, I think we're looking at quite a while before it wraps up.
So, and it's not just the investigation, but let's say the investigation takes a long time for them to finally file criminal charges, arrest him, indict him. Then the defense is going to take a long time to go through all that stuff too. So it's the whole process is going to be a lot longer than anybody expects. But you brought up an interesting point. So there could be very high profile victims or witnesses in the case. What happens if they don't want to testify or they don't want to be part of it?
Well, they're not going to have a choice. The grand jury subpoena, unless they have a Fifth Amendment right, they are going to be testifying in front of that grand jury. And now the smart ones, frankly, probably are going to take with their lawyers, and if they don't have any liability, they'll have private interviews, and they won't be paraded to the grand jury, and they won't cause a big stink and have their name in the paper. But the ones that fight it, those are the ones we're going to hear about.
And potential victims that don't want to be involved they can still come testify, but they can just not be helpful if they don't want to be involved. And then maybe they wouldn't be called later if they don't want to participate, basically, or admit that they were a victim, because there's been some allegations publicly of people that it might be embarrassing if they were a victim in this case. So we'll see how that kind of all plays out. There was something else I was going to ask. Oh, how do federal prosecutors get around like civil cases? If you have, let's say there's 20 people we don't even know about that have sent demand letters or sued him, and there's some kind of confidential settlement, and they sign that, they're going to not say anything else about this, confidentiality, non-disclosure, whatever it may be. How do federal prosecutors get around that to force these people to testify honestly in criminal cases?
The Supreme Court and a lot of other cases have already said there is a public policy, and that public policy says if a crime is committed, you can't contract to not testify about a criminal act. So even though they have a non-disclosure agreement, it's not going to affect any criminal case. It's not going to affect the federal prosecutor. It's not going to affect the grand jury. They still have to testify because, in this country, you can't say, I'm going to sign a contract, so I'm not going to testify if someone committed a murder. That's against the public policy, and you're going to have to testify.
And a lot of these confidentiality agreements, because we've been a part of so many of them, we know a lot of them say, you can't testify to this, you can't say that, can't do this, unless by a court order. And sometimes you get court orders in these cases to say you do have to testify about this. And most of the time, you don't have to give back the money. A lot of times there'll be restitution as part of this as well. Like if, there are major damages, which if this stuff is true, there would be major damages. P. Diddy would owe them money potentially in restitution. If he's already paid them in the civil side, that'll be part of it as well. But it's not like they're going to be violating their confidentiality. So they're going to have to give back Cassie, for example, if she is a victim in this criminal case, she's not going to have to give back whatever settlement, most likely, because of what we're talking about, the public policy, what's in a lot of confidentiality agreements. And so that's not going to be a way to really protect him from a lot of these crimes. That's more like can't go on the news and talk about, oh, he paid me $50 million and he admitted he did all this. You can't do that. But if the federal prosecutor calls you in for an interview and says, did this happen, that happened, or subpoena you, you got to testify, especially if the court orders you to.
Right.
So what's next? We talked about how they're going to get all this evidence that they got from the raids. Maybe they'll raid other places, right? And search other places.
Well, it seems to me that they should be raiding the studio in New York, from what I read and from what the complaints say.
Okay, so maybe there's going to be more raids, more searches here in the near future. Then they analyze all that evidence. Then they potentially put it before a grand jury. Then the grand jury indicts. Then we get, Diddy either in custody or making bail. What do you think? How do you think that process would go?
Well, that
Knowing
could
how
be
much money.
interesting because we have some history of these very wealthy individuals being arrested for sex trafficking, and the courts either not allowing them to have bond or such a high bond that they actually stay in custody. Uh, it's going to be a really, really high bond. He probably can afford it,
I mean,
but
if he
it's going
can't,
to be
I don't think anybody can. He's
well.
about as wealthy as they come.
Well, he's listed as a billionaire. Forbes listed him as a billionaire, so he's got the money. But it's going to be a really high bond if the court gives a bond. There's even a chance the federal system has a situation where bond is denied and you have to stay in custody if they think that you're a risk to the witnesses or a threat to the witnesses or a threat to flee. Now,
Well,
the thing about P. Diddy, the thing about him is where can he hide? I mean, he's so
well known.
world renowned that they're going to find him wherever he is. So he'd have a tough time fleeing.
Yeah, but I mean, but at this, on the other hand, like he is the prototypical flight risk, right? He has places everywhere, private planes, people willing to literally do anything, die for him. He's got more money than he knows what to do with, or than he could possibly spend. So, I mean, those are all the things that check the boxes for flight risk. Also,
Right.
based on the charges potentially, and maybe some prior charges or similar charges or allegations, I think they would have a pretty good argument that he's a threat to the community or he's a danger to the community, based on the charges, again, if they go forward. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation because he's going to have the best legal team. He's going to have more people working on this case than anybody. He's going to have all the resources available to him. And again, witnesses and people. We can think back to a couple cases. R. Kelly, similar charges, ends up getting convicted. Not nearly as much money and power at the time he was indicted as P. Diddy. But then you look at Johnny Depp, and the accusations in the civil case by Amber Heard and her team is these witnesses are going to get up there and say anything they possibly can to help Johnny Depp. Well, P. Diddy's going to have that to the nth degree. I mean, he's going to have people in his life that he's probably changed their life for the better, or just, financially supported them or made their careers or whatever it may be, where there's going to be some kind of good old boys club that's going to be difficult, I think, for the victims to overcome. But there's just so much smoke that in these kinds of cases, sometimes people back into the bushes and don't want to be associated, Jeffrey Epstein style, that, they were all his best friend and want to be friends with him, want to party with him. Then when it went belly up, nobody wanted to touch him with a 10-foot pole. So it's going to be really interesting to see how all of this plays out. But
Well, it's kind of already happened. He's withdrawn from board seats and leadership positions in corporations. He was spokesman for some vodka company and some gin company, and they've broken what?
Ciroc, I think is what it is.
So, and they've broken their contract with him. So people are already starting to distance themselves.
Yeah, and I think that this is going to be really interesting to see how this plays out, because I can't think of somebody with a higher profile or more money to get caught up in something like this, maybe ever. I guess Jeffrey Epstein probably would be the only other one I can think of. But how do the feds look at this? Are the feds scared of anybody, $1 billion or not, famous or not? Is there a level for them that, even again, I keep bringing back Jeffrey Epstein. I'm not saying that P. Diddy is Jeffrey Epstein. There's no charges or convictions at this point. So we're just kind of talking about, there was a lot of fear that people talked about in, politics in Washington and the media and the feds and whatever, with what Jeffrey Epstein knew, who he could flip on. Will there be any of that with P. Diddy? Do you think there could be some kind of deal made where he testifies against somebody else or gets somebody else caught up in it? How do the feds look at this?
Well, first of all, there's always potentially a deal. I mean, the deals are always a potential. I mean, when I remember years ago when some of your listeners may remember when they were prosecuting General Noriega, if you had a client that knew something about General Noriega, and I did, the candy store was open. You can get any deal you wanted because they wanted Noriega so bad. So you never know about a deal. But in this case, remember, I do not believe that this case was an isolated incident that New York suddenly went and searched these houses. My guess is the Department of Justice knew about it before it happened. My guess is the U.S. Attorney from the Southern District of New York went to the District of Columbia, talked to the Attorney General or the Associate Attorney General, told them, hey, this is going to happen and we want to give you a heads up because of the press and the publicity, and is it okay? So I'm sure that there were approvals before this happened. Secondly, and I'm sure that, and I have great respect for assistant U.S. attorneys, there is no fear. That assistant U.S. attorney relishes the chance of getting in the courtroom with these supposedly high dollar lawyers and going head to head with them and, crushing them. Again, if you're an assistant U.S. attorney, that's the attitude you got to have.
Yeah, and I remember I watched some of Billions. I didn't finish it, but that's pretty much what the U.S. attorney and assistant U.S. attorneys felt in that case. So it's going to be really interesting. It's definitely going to be out there. It's going to be covered. It's federal court, so we're not going to get as much information as we do on a lot of cases. It'll be probably more similar to the R. Kelly situation. Will they go with RICO like they did against R. Kelly?
Sure, there's an excellent chance. That's interesting. RICO's great because RICO allows so much forfeiture. RICO's a wonderful
and it lets you bring so many different things in to prove the enterprise and not just sex trafficking or whatever it is. It's like, oh, this guy and that guy saw this and heard this, and this is how weird it was in the house. And you just make them look like a generally bad guy, and they're a lot more likely to be convicted.
Absolutely.
Yep. And that was a big part of the R. Kelly prosecutions as well. So we will continue to follow this and cover this. Hit that like button if you guys have enjoyed this video or enjoyed this content, and let us know in the comments what questions you have. And if you want us to keep following it, I appreciate you guys joining me. Thanks, Dad, for joining me on this one.
Sure.
Until next time, we're out of here. Thanks for watching another episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you enjoyed the episode, please hit the thumbs up and share with your friends who may be interested here on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. And don't forget to check out the Lawyer You Know podcast with new seasons dropping every quarter. If you have a case you want to talk to us about, if it's a personal injury case, wrongful death, catastrophic injury, car accident, or slip and fall case, please email us at lawyeryouknow@gmail.com. And of course, all these links I just mentioned are included in the description below on this episode and every episode. So until next time, this is Peter Tragos, the Lawyer You Know.